Welcome all to today's Iran Colloquium. My name is Travis Sada, the director of the program in Iranian Studies and acting chair of the Council on Middle East Studies at Yale. Today, we're excited to be joined by Dr. Reza Pourjavady, an intellectual historian with research interests centered on philosophy during the Safavid and Qajar periods in Iran. Dr. Pourjavady completed his BA in philosophy at the University of Tehran and earned an MA in Islamic studies from the University of Leeds. Subsequently, he further pursued studies at the Free University of Berlin under the supervision of Dr. Sabine Schmidtke, during which he collaborated with her on a project on the life and works of the Jewish philosopher Ibn Kammūna. From 2008 to 2013, he contributed to the project Rational Science in Islam at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University. He returned to Germany, working in various universities as a researcher and visiting professor. During the recent academic year of 2022 and 23, he was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he focused on a project related to the reception of Averroes in the Islamic East. Presently, he serves as an adjunct professor at Goethe University Frankfurt, where he recently completed his habilitation. His talk today is entitled Aristotelianism in Late Safavid Iran. It's truly an honor to welcome him here to our colloquium. He's published widely on a variety of topics in what we would call the post-classical period of Islamic thought. Before turning it over to Dr. Pourjavady, I should say that today's format is that of a webinar. So Dr. Pourjavady will speak for around 45 minutes, after which time we'll have questions and answers. You can pose your questions in the question and answer section of Zoom. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Travis, for introducing me and for the kind introduction. Let me share the screen. Okay. The title of this talk is Aristotelianism in Late Safavid Iran. Before delving into the specifics, I'd like to clarify my definition of Aristotelianism within the framework of Safavid philosophy. I consider three criteria for Safavid Aristotelianism. One, acknowledging Aristotle as the preeminent master of philosophy. Two, treating Aristotle's works as the primary texts of philosophy and studying them with the help of exegetical texts. Three, expressing dissent from Avicenna on certain substantial philosophical issues. Why do I regard opposition to Avicenna as a criterion for Safavid Aristotelianism? Because during the Safavid era, if a philosopher's viewpoint closely aligns with Avicenna, it would be more accurate to label him as an Abyssinian philosopher. An example is Abdul Razzaq Lahiji, the son-in-law of Mullah Sadra. Although Lahiji endorses the views of Aristotle, throughout his works, he tried to be as closely as possible to Avicenna. Therefore, it would be more appropriate to consider him an Abyssinian philosopher. Therefore, it would be Abyssinian philosopher. Thus, with the context of Safavid intellectual history, it is more fitting to invoke Aristotelianism when a philosopher engages in critical examination of Avicenna's ideas. When did the Safavid Aristotelianism start? In the title of my talk, proposed 2.5 months ago, I specified the starting point as 1640. However, upon further consideration, I'm inclined to extend it back to the first quarter of the 17th century. The heightened interest in Aristotle seems to have originated with a philosopher active during the reign of Shah Abbas I, namely Abul Qasim Mirfendersky. Who died in 1640. Mirfendersky is widely recognized for his commentary on the Lagu Yoga Vasishta Jug Vasesht, a treatise associated with the Advaita Vedanta school of ancient Indian philosophy. This commentary underscores his efforts to employ Sufi perspectives in delving into the Vedantic viewpoints. Yet, throughout his career, Mirfendersky primarily taught Philosopher in Isfahan. In his treatise on motion, Risala fil Haraka, Mirfendersky bolsters his arguments by invoking statements from Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. Similarly, in his treatise on gradation, Risale dar Tashkik, he cites Aristotle's metaphysics as his primary source. However, Avicenna was not referred to in either of these works. Why did Mirfendersky opt for Aristotle's works over those of Avicenna, which were more widely available during his time? In the topics of these two treatises, he found himself more aligned with Aristotle's positions than with those of Avicenna. Overall, he appears to take a critical approach to Avicenna's ideas. In a philosophical qasida he composed, Mirfendersky critiqued Avicenna, attributing to him a certain naivety in philosophical understanding. در نیابد این سخن را هیچ فهم ظاهری گر ابو نصر استی و گر بو علی سیناستی. Those who have superficial understanding cannot grasp this idea, which applies even to al-Farabi and Avicenna. The Safavid Aristotelianism seems to have commenced with Mirfendersky. However, given the limited extent of Mirfendersky's philosophical writings, it remains challenging to ascertain the degree to which he embraced Aristotelian philosophy. According to an account provided by one of the Safavid philosophers, Ali Quli Beg, the son of Qarachabai Khan, we have precise information about which of Aristotle's works were accessible to the Safavid philosophers and which were not. Among the notable absent works were physics and metaphysics. Although we previously highlighted Mirfendersky's reference to Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, we noted that these works of Aristotle were not available to the Safavid philosophers. Mirfendersky's allusion to Aristotle's physics and metaphysics may stem from his indirect access to these works. It is plausible that he had depended on short commentaries on these works by Averroes. There are similarities between the positions of Mirfendersky and Averroes that support this hypothesis. For instance, much like Averroes, Mirfendersky contends that the relationship between God and the cosmos should not be considered a matter of metaphysics per se, but rather discussed within the realm of physics. I believe that the arrival of Averroes' works in the Safavid capital, Isfahan, at that specific juncture could have played a pivotal role in shaping Safavid Aristotelianism. Nierfendersky and his successors persisted in adopting Aristotle's perspective and gravitated toward Aristotelianism over alternative philosophical schools. Their rationale for this preference lay in the accessibility of Aristotle's views through Averroes' commentaries. In the early decades of the 17th century, Averroes' works made their way to Isfahan for the first time. Subsequently, numerous copies were produced within Isfahan and later disseminated to other Safavid cities, including Qom, Shiraz, Yazd, and Mashhad. It appears that these manuscripts were originally brought from Egypt or the Levant. The fact that it took over 4 centuries for Averroes' works to reach the Islamic East is an interesting story in itself. However, this is not the subject of this paper. Here, our focus is on the outcome of this transmission and the impact of Averroes' works on changing the perspective of some Safavid philosophers. The collected works of Averroes upon reaching Isfahan in the early 17th century were organized into 3 codices. One was a compendium of logic, which contained Averroes' middle commentaries, talkhisat, on the 4 books of Aristotle's organon: Kitab al-Maḥmūd, categories; Kitab al-Ibara, the interpretazione; Kitab al-Qiyas, prior analytics; and Kitab al-Burhan, posterior analytics. The earliest known manuscript of this compendium, originating in the Safavid territory, was finalized in 1623. This logical compendium, among Averroes' works, gained significant popularity in the Safavid region, with more than 50 copies being produced. The second codex contained a compendium of natural philosophy and metaphysics, which was Averroes' short commentaries, Jawame, on Aristotle's Kitab al-Sama' al-Tabi'i, physics; Kitab al-Sama' wal-Alam, the Kalo; Kitab al-Kawn wal-Fasad, the generations and corruptions; Kitab al-Athar al-Ilbiya, meteorology; Kitab al-Nafs, the animal; and Kitab ma ba'd al-Tabi'a, metaphysics. This collection of Averroes' works ranked second in popularity, with at least 25 copies originating in the Safavid domain and era. The oldest Safavid copy of this compendium that we are aware of was produced in 1642. However, this codex might have been accessible in Isfahan a couple of decades earlier. The third codex was Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, referred to by Safavid scholars as Radd al-Tahafut. That is Averroes' commentary on Ghazali's Tahafut al-Philosopher, the incoherence of the philosophers. At least 6 copies of this work were produced in Isfahan in the 3rd quarter of the 17th century. Tahafut al-Tahafut likely arrived in Isfahan with a delay of a couple of decades compared to Averroes' exegetical works. During the 1620s and 1630s, the works of Averroes were not widely recognized among the philosophers of Isfahan. Mir stands out as the sole philosopher of that period whom we can reasonably assume had engaged with these works. However, by the 1640s, several philosophers of the Safavid era had become acquainted with Averroes' works. In the writings of Rajab Ali Tabrizi, who was probably a student of Mir Fendersky, the adherence to Aristotelianism became even more pronounced. The historian Wali Qoli Beg Shamlu, who likely studied with Tabrizi for some time, praised Tabrizi's philosophical understanding, alluding that nobody, not even al-Farabi, grasped Aristotle's philosophy to the extent that Tabrizi did. Tabrizi's Usul Asifian Principles, a work composed between 1642 and 1655, contains a synopsis of the author's philosophical views. In this work, Tabrizi opposed the ideas of other philosophers on several issues. Modern scholarship has generally assumed that the target of Tabrizi's criticisms in this work was primarily Mullah Sadra. However, in this work, Tabrizi dealt only occasionally with the views of Mullah Sadra. One example is his rejection of Mullah Sadra's idea of transubstantial motion, which according to Tabrizi is the position of Ta'ifatun min al-Fudala, a group of excellent scholars. Another instance emerges in the discussion of Ibn Kammūna's sophistry regarding the uniqueness of God, where Tabrizi blames Mullah Sadra for denouncing Ibn Kammūna for allegedly originating the sophistry. Here again, Tabrizi refers to Mullah Sadra as one of the excellent scholars, Ba'dul Fudala. However, in many instances, Tabrizi was targeting another group of philosophers whom he referred to as al-Muta'akhirun, the later philosophers, by whom he arguably meant Avicenna and the Abyssinian philosophers. There are 19 references to al-Muta'akhirun in Tabrizi's Usul Asifiyya. A detailed study of Usul Asifiyya suggests that Tabrizi intended to put forward in this work his own interpretation of Aristotelian philosophy as far as it stands against other interpretations, particularly the Abyssinian one. Tabrizi held the pseudo-theology of Aristotle in high esteem, considering it the pinnacle of Aristotle's philosophical teaching. Interest in the theology resurfaced in the Islamic East in the late 15th century, exemplified by the writings of Jalaluddin Davani. Throughout the Safavid era, the theology gained prominence, but its peak popularity occurred in the second half of the 17th century, aligning with the time when Rajab Ali Tabrizi and his students extensively engaged with its study. Influenced profoundly by pseudo-theology, Rajab Ali Tabrizi's ideas prominently featured significant Neoplatonic elements. Notably, he adhered to the Neoplatonic concepts of emanation, emphasizing the successive emanation of beings from a supreme transcend source known as the One. However, he considered a solid understanding of Aristotle's broader philosophical principles to be a prerequisite for comprehending this work. Given the unavailability of many of Aristotle's works to the Safavid scholars, Tabrizi heavily relied on Averroes' short and middle commentaries on Aristotle's works, al-Jawami and Talkhisat. On one occasion, he vaguely referred to Averroes as one of the commentators on Aristotle's words, بعد المفسر كلام أرسطوطالیس. In addition to these commentaries, Tabrizi effectively employed Averroes' tahafut or tahafut. Indeed, he derived benefit from Averroes' perspectives for two reasons. First, to comprehend Aristotle's ideas, and second, to critique Avicenna's ideas. An example of Tabrizi's critiquing Avicenna with the endorsement of Averroes' arguments might clarify my point. In cognitive theory, Avicenna asserts that cognition is rooted in the mental existence of things rather than their concrete quiddity. Contrary to this notion, Tabrizi returns to the Aristotelian concept of abstraction, tajrid, underscoring its significance in understanding the process of acquiring intelligible forms. According to Tabrizi, knowledge results from transforming the sensible form into the intelligible form, stripping it off its corporeal attachments and converting it from a particular to a universal form. Moreover, aligning with Averroes, Tabrizi rejects Avicenna's recognition of the active intellect, supposedly a celestial intellect, as the bestower of knowledge to humans. According to Tabrizi, the human intellect is entirely independent in the acquisition of knowledge. Tabrizi was teaching at the prestigious Madraseh Sheikh Lutfullah. Evidence gleaned from numerous copies of Averroes' short and middle commentaries produced by Tabrizi's students suggests that he actively encouraged his students to engage with Averroes' works, possibly even incorporating Averroes' commentaries into his teaching curriculum. Following Rajab Ali Tabrizi, his students embraced Aristotelian philosophy. Among them, Ali Quli Beg, the son of Qarajqai Khan, stood out for his exceptional dedication to the teaching of Aristotle. Ali Quli Beg's magnum opus is a Persian philosophical compendium encompassing logic, natural philosophy, and metaphysics, titled Ihya-e-Hikmat, the Revival of Philosophy. The work was composed around 1670. He also authored a commentary on the pseudo-theology of Aristotle titled Tamhidat wa Tanqihat Orthologia, Preliminaries and Inquiries of the Theology. Ali Quli Beg's primary objective in composing these two works was to provide a comprehensive commentary on all of Aristotle's philosophical teachings, considering Aristotle as the foremost guide in philosophy. Additionally, Ali Quli Beg aimed to offer a substitute for Avicenna's Shefa. In his treatise Āghāz wa Anjām, penned around 1680, Ali Quli Beg advised philosophy students against delving into Avicenna's Shefa, noting that Avicenna's positions, critiqued by Averroes and himself, were deemed incorrect in crucial matters. Instead, he recommended the students turn their attention to his own work, the Ihya, the Revival of Philosophy. In contrast to Rajab Ali Tabrizi, Ali Quli Beg employed a more systematic approach in presenting Aristotle's teachings. He also drew from a broader array of exegetical works, incorporating the writings of Alexander of Aphrodiseus, Olympiodorus, al-Farabi, Yahya ibn Adi, Miskawayh, Avicenna, and Averroes. It is worth noting that several works of al-Farabi and Yahya ibn Adi are available to us solely through the manuscripts produced in this period in Isfahan. This prompts the question of whether the surge in availability of these philosophical works in Isfahan at that time was merely coincidental, or if the philosophers of the time were actively engaged in a search for these philosophical texts. The strong adherence to Aristotle persisted beyond Rajab Ali Tabrizi's immediate students, extending for decades. In this slide, we explore two successive generations of Rajab Ali Tabrizi. The former represents his senior students, while the latter comprises his younger students. Beyond these two generations, Aristotelian philosophy remained a focal point of some philosophical training for at least two more generations. However, notable nuances emerged in the later period, both in philosophical perspectives and areas of interest. In this later phase, a heightened emphasis on logic becomes more discernible. Additionally, starting from at least 1695, it can be asserted with confidence that Averroes' exegetical works were incorporated into the curriculum of philosophy students. Now, let's explore the Aristotelian works written during the Safavid era. I categorize these works into three groups: commentaries on Aristotle's works and pseudo-Aristotle's works, two independent Aristotelian compositions, and marginalia Aristotelis. In the first category, a notable work deserving attention is Ali Quli Beg, the son of Qajar Khan's Ihya Hikmat, the revival of philosophy. This book, as mentioned before, serves as a comprehensive commentary on Aristotle's writings on logic, natural philosophy, and metaphysics. In the present edition of this book, only sections on natural philosophy and metaphysics are featured. However, the cross-references within these sections suggest that the original work encompassed a logical section too. The treatise on logic, Risale dar Mantiq, initially considered a separate work attributed to Ali Quli Beg, should be recognized as the first section of this work. Alongside this important contribution, there exist two additional commentaries on the theology of Aristotle: Ali Quli Beg's complete Persian commentary on this work, and Qazi Said Qumi's gloss in Arabic on the first 4 chapters of this work. Despite the erroneous attribution of the theology to Aristotle, the Safavid commentators treated the work as authentic. Working under this assumption, they compared the theology of Aristotle's views with the genuine works of Aristotle and consulted other exegetical works on Aristotle. Therefore, it is crucial to take these commentaries into account within the framework of Safavid Aristotelian works. The second category encompasses independent philosophical works authored by Safavid Aristotelian philosophers. While I have provided a list of some works here in this slide, it's important to note that there are several additional items that warrant considerations. The third category comprises marginalia, where we delve into Safavid copies of Aristotelian works. Averroes' short and middle commentaries hold particular significance as they have frequently used as textbooks and often feature marginal notes. Beyond Averroes' works, it is essential to examine Safavid copies of Aristotle's writings, Pseudo-Aristotle's works, as well as Safavid copies of the works by other commentators of Aristotle, namely Alexander Aphrodiseus, Al-Farabi, and Yahya ibn Adi. To illustrate the importance of marginalia, I have provided an example in this slide and the next one. Manuscript Garrett 849Y contains one of the Safavid copies of Averroes' short commentary on Aristotle's physics. And this manuscript is rich with marginal notes. Through these annotations, it becomes evident that the work was utilized as an instructional resource by a certain Ahund whose identity has remained unknown to us, with one of the students recording the Ahund's remarks in the margin. In this slide, the sentence which I underlined in red is the following. به تاریخ شهر سفر 1108 این درس در میان بود آخوند فرمودند. In the month of Safar 1108 during the class the Ahund stated. And in this slide the marginal remark underlined is پوشیده نماند که گفتگوی بسیار با آخوند دامزدلو نمودیم تا بعد از آن معنی حد حرکت را به این طریق ساختند. It is worth noting that we engaged in extensive discussions with the Ahund. May his shadow endure. Consequently, he arrived at the following interpretation of the definition of motion. The instruction of Aristotelian philosophy based on Averroes' exegetical works persisted with diminished intensity for a few decades following the fall of Isfahan in 722. However, over time, Akbarian mysticism in post-Safavid Iran gradually gained prominence, overshadowing Aristotelian philosophy. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Safavids, a significant number of philosophy students migrated to the Indian subcontinent. Evidently, Averroes' exegetical works enjoyed widespread readership in India, while some copies of Averroes' exegetical works presently held in Indian libraries are Safavid products. Numerous others were locally produced in the 18th and 19th centuries. In conclusion, in the Safavid realm, in the initiation of Mir Fendersky and its subsequent development by Rajab Ali Tabrizi led to a form of adherence to Aristotelian thought. I'm hesitant to categorize it as prepateticism due to the term's ambiguity, especially given that Avicenna also belonged to the prepatetic tradition. In contrast, I believe Aristotelianism is clearer and more precise in its definition. The reception of Averroes played a pivotal role in shaping this Aristotelianism. Averroes' works, available to the Safavid philosophers, significantly contributed to redefining Aristotelian philosophy. Influenced by Averroes, many philosophers in this era consciously distanced themselves from Avicennian thought, striving to align more closely with Aristotelian principles. However, it is essential to note that the impact of the pseudo-theology of Aristotle introduced some notable Neoplatonic elements into their philosophical framework. In a broader consideration, understanding this current helps us to grasp the philosophical context in late Safavid Iran. It has been established that during the century following Mulla Sadra, the Safavid and post-Safavid philosophers generally did not adhere to Mulla Sadra's ideas, contrary to the prevailing notion that Avicennian philosophy dominated in this period. I posited that it was, in fact, Aristotelian philosophy that constituted the primary intellectual current. This nuanced exploration invites us to re-evaluate historical narratives, emphasizing the dynamism and diversity within the late Safavid philosophy. As we navigate through these intellectual currents, we gain deeper insights into the complexity of philosophical thoughts in this period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reza, for this very illuminating talk and inviting us into this conversation. I have several questions that I can pose to you right off. I also want to invite the many of you in the webinar who are attending to post questions that you may have for Dr. Pourjavady through the Q&A function in the Zoom window. So my first question to you, thank you. First of all, that was really just a really wide canvas, and I appreciated having the context. And also, I know you have worked on the Mughal reception too, and so I'd love to get into that in some more depth. But I wanted to narrow in on the Aeneids here, the Plotinus and the pseudo-Aristotelian kind of framework that seems to be crucial to the reception of Aristotle. I was curious first if you could say some more about that, because you mentioned emanationism and then also Akbari mysticism, and just how the nature of the theology, excuse me, why it's so kind of pivotal here, it seems, to this reception of Aristotle, why it holds on. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, you know, something that happened, well, theology was important, and the philosophers, the Safavid philosophers were much inclined towards the theology. But at the time when Tahafut reached Isfahan, there was also another perspective, because Averroes is against the theology, and that was evident for these Safavid philosophers. The work that Rajab Ali Tabrizi wrote is called Usul Asafiyya, but the other name which is given to the work is Al-Asl al-Asil, the authentic principle. And that authentic principle is that from the one, only one proceeds. It occurs to me that the challenge was to establish this principle against what he read in Averroes Tahafut al-Tahafut. Because that Averroes said that this is not authentically by Aristotle. So he wanted to say, no, this is the authentic principle and should be considered an authentic principle by Aristotle, as Averroes himself considered it authentic in his earlier work, in his short commentary in metaphysics. So Averroes also had this, he was not sure whether this principle is authentic or not. But anyway, in this period, we see some scholars like Tabrizi, who shows, full support of this work, and some scholars who were in the middle, did not embrace all the teachings of this work. And there were also some scholars who totally disagreed with this work. And they considered it a total rubbish. So there was also this type of understanding of the text. But Aristotelians, most of them considered it authentic. And yeah.
So no, I ask that because it does depending on your reading, right? Whether you place authenticity or some kind of credence in the work, it does change the nature of Aristotle's project.
Yes,
very much so. And then indeed, I'm just very curious as well. I mean, we have several questions here that I want to get to, so I want to be mindful of it. But just to follow up, and maybe these will dovetail with some of these questions too. What the work provides, of course, in an emanationist framework is a rationalization for kind of the occult broadly, or natural magic in the world. And so I'm curious if the points of divergence are between the kind of Aristotelian and Avicennan models, if they at all account for issues around the ontology of miracles, if that at all intersects, or if the divergences purely relate to other elements of cosmology. So I'd be curious to hear, because when you read the theology, it's hard not to read it through a kind of so-called Neoplatonist framework that is very much invested in an emanationist project. And of the Isharat of Ibn Sina is one venue for that kind of emanationism, but there are many others. So I'd just be curious what are the tensions in the points of disagreement around Avicenna in particular. And indeed, I think an anonymous attendee is asking, were there any Avicennians around the time, but that are kind of pushing back against this kind of resurgence of Aristotelianism, as you define it. But my question, maybe you could answer that, but my question is more, is this kind of Aristotelianism that is itself branded in a Neoplatonic, frame, is it undermining in any way a cosmology of emanation, or is it just confirming it? Because you could make the case that Avicenna's cosmology is one of emanation in some sense. Obviously, you talked about cognition as being an important point of divergence there, but the rationalization of miracle and magic within the framework of science is one of the central pieces of the Isharat, and indeed one of the main lessons that I think that it conveys over time.
Yeah. those who were Aristotelian at the time, one disagreement that they had with Avicenna was on cognition theory, and the other one was on the soul.
Yeah.
So
yes.
They believe that we cannot, determine that the soul was co-originated with the body. If we believe that the soul is eternal, we cannot say that it has been originated. And then also about after death, they argued that we can no longer talk about soul when there is no body. So there are, the serious criticism of Avicenna's psychology on cognition theory, and also on issues related to physics. And also, they were not happy with with Abyssinian God, because they considered that we shouldn't define these attributions of God. So we don't know the quality of God's knowledge. We don't know the quality of God's power. All these attributions we shouldn't talk about. So this is something which can be found both in Averroes' writings as well as in the theology of Aristotle. So on this point, there's a correspondence between Averroes and the theology of Aristotle against Avicenna.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you for giving that specificity too. That was very, very helpful, and fascinating around the psychology and all the implications around cognition, certainly, and then the whole framework of the divine itself, of God itself. It's a very beautiful response. I appreciate that. I see there's several questions here, so let's delve into them. This is just such a rich conversation. Many of the comments that have come in have noted. So I don't know if you're able to see the questions in the Q&A section as well, but I could start reading off and we could just go one by one. There's Khalil Zan, that this fascinating talk. I was wondering what implications the return to Aristotle from an ontological point of view had. Did Safavid philosophers criticize and put away the idea and the concept of mumkin al-wujud, translated here as contingent existence, which is so central to Islamic theology. So maybe we could talk about, that gets us into cosmology as well, and the issues of ontology.
Yeah, well, some philosophers, Tabrizi himself did not mind this division of wajib al-wujud and mumkin al-wujud. But later, some scholars didn't like it. At least they didn't like God to be considered wajib al-wujud. So they thought that if we talk about God as, wajib al-wujud, we somehow, we said something that we shouldn't say about God. So it's better to leave it and avoid it. But the fact that mumkin al-wujud, or the contingents, are when they are against this division, then they wouldn't call things in this world mumkin al-wujud. But this is something that we see in Qazi Said Qumi, but it is not very, common among all the all these Aristotelian philosophers.
Yeah, and actually, I kind of gestured to this going now to the next question about pushback. I mentioned the isharat. You rely on the talk on kind of manuscript distribution as one measure, one index for this shift. Is there pushback from quote unquote Abyssinians? What about, and I'm curious, it's my own, for interest, what about, these kinds of textbooks, not the Shifat so much, but like the Isharat, did those continue to circulate in a Safavid context? Yeah.
Yes, yes. At the time, particularly Shifa was more popular than the Isharat. There was another teacher in Isfahan, Agha Hossein Khansari, who was teaching the Shifa. So there were two major schools of philosophy at the time. One was more inclined into Aristotelian thought, and the other was based on Avicenna, but they were reading Avicenna actually with a critical perspective. But the textbooks were, they used Avicenna's Shifa as the textbook. So Agha Hossein Khansari wrote gloss on Avicenna's Shifa. And we see that, his son also wrote gloss on Avicenna's Shifa, and several students of them. But they have also critical perspective. So they were not defending Avicenna.
Yeah, no, thank you. And actually, picking up on this point of the larger context here, Sam Hodgkin asks around the political, cultural stakes, what, if anything, in these times and places of adopting neo-Aristotelian ideas, say, of abandoning elements of the Aristotelian tradition. So can we read this in a larger social political framework? Or is this something, maybe more scholastic, quote unquote, I'm adding that there, but, to what extent do the political events in the larger context, shape this turn?
Well, I tend to believe, I'm not so totally sure, but I tend to believe that Aristotelian philosophy was supported, at least in the early, during the reign of Shah Abbas II, was supported by the Safavids. In general, what we know, and that I think we can say with certainty that the Safavids philosophers, the Safavids did not want Akbarian philosophy to be dominant. They wanted to push it down. And I think the fact that the most prestigious place in Isfahan was the teaching place of Rajab Ali Tabrizi is a sign that the government, the Safavid government, was supporting it. And we know that Rajab Ali was in good contact with the Shah and with the viziers. He sometimes accompanied the Shah in his trips. So he had a good contact. And we see that it continued, this support continued for decades. But during the time of Shah Sultan Hussein, the last monarch of the Safavids, there was no support anymore of the Aristotelian philosophers. So the Akbarians were against philosophy, so they didn't support it.
Just to add to that, since your answer really invites this reflection, what about the kind of contemporary Mughal or even Ottoman context? But I'm thinking more particularly in the Mughal context around the Akbarian kind of themes and trends that you see in philosophy in the Indian subcontinent. Is there any reaction either way toward this Aristotelianism in Safavid Iran to events that are going on contemporaneously in, say, India, or vice versa? Is there do you trace any awareness to this in India of what's going on in Iran?
Yeah, what I know, I mean, we don't. This is a question that I'm not. I don't have a good answer for. I know that for instance, Mir Fendersky
Yes.
was going to India, so I
Right.
don't
Right.
know. Maybe somehow he was inspired by an Indian philosopher, an Indian scholar on this point. This is something which I don't know, but I know that the Safavid scholars in the early 18th century, some of them went to India, and like Hazin al-Lahiji and some other scholars, there were uh, scholars from India who were studying in Isfahan at the time in the uh, late 17th century and early 18th century. And then, following the collapse of the
Mm-hmm.
city, they moved back to India, and they were teaching there. So I assume that somehow the teaching continued there. And we see that, continued for a long time because some copies were produced in the 19th century.
Mm.
So it continued in India. As for the Ottomans, we know that many of these manuscripts, the Ottomans did not have short and middle commentaries of Averroes. The first copy that they received it from Iran in the 18th century. They had access to the Tahafut, but not to the commentaries. So it was something, but then some of the activities which started in Iran during the Safavids continued among the Ottoman by the Ottoman scholars. For instance, now the works that we have on logic of Farabi are based on manuscripts of Soleimani manuscripts and in Istanbul and elsewhere. All these manuscripts, most of them were produced in Safavid Iran.
Yeah.
So within a few decades, many of them were taken to Istanbul, and they were studied immediately. So Farabi was known by the Ottoman scholars based on the manuscripts produced in the Safavid Isfahan.
No, that's very, very interesting. And these exchanges are and the what gets accessed and when, that tells quite a bit around social history. Moving, as it were, back into the intellectual realm here, Michael Lessman, who I believe is in Egypt right now, notes you mentioned Tabrizi rejects the existence of the active intellect, and I thought that picking up here on these critiques of Avicenna as a separate entity, does he say that there is an active intellect, but that it is internal to the human mind? For instance, is Tabrizi aware of Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi and his arguments for rejecting the active intellect? Right, because there is, of course, a much earlier set of critiques directed toward Avicenna. So, does Abu Barakat, feature in any way in this regard?
No, he didn't refer to Abu Barakat. And what we can see, he didn't reject the active intellect. but he didn't include active intellect in his description of, acquiring knowledge. So he talks about acquiring knowledge with no reference to the active intellect, which shows that to him, the active intellect played no role in it. But this, the way that he presented it is very short and concise. So we don't have much detail about his criticism of the Abyssinian active intellect.
Oh, perfect. That's very helpful to have that clarification. And actually returning now back into this realm of emanationism and ultimately kind of paranormal causation that I think is at the core of the theology of Aristotle. Matt Melvin Pushki writes, brilliant as always, so fascinating that Safavid philosophers were also going back to Aristotle to depart from Avicenna via Averroes, ironically, as not sufficiently Neoplatonic. This rhymes, he notes, with Mir Damad's use of Pythagoras and total dedication to the Uthologia, right, to the theology of the pseudo, the work of Plotinus there in Arabic, to the same end. Given that Mir Firdariski was likewise an important occult scientific thinker and Mir Damad's associate, to what extent do you suspect his move to Aristotelianism was motivated by his own work in alchemy and yoga, especially given Avicenna's critique of the science? Right. I mean, particularly of alchemy. Yeah. This is a great question.
Well, I will go to the realm of speculation if I, want to answer these questions.
Yes,
so
yes, they're big
it's
questions.
Not that easy. So I mean, it's an interesting point. I don't know. I don't know to what extent he wanted to, defend alchemy when he was against Avicenna, but he might be motivated for several reasons to be against Avicenna. But I think one part of it was, reading Averroes' works, and by reading Averroes' works, he had some arguments against Avicenna.
Yeah, I see that, and it's not that Ibn Rushd is entirely taken up. Is that, or is he? I mean, is it that it's a selective reading for these purposes? How would you characterize it?
By Mir Firdariski, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is a selective reading. Yeah, as you said. But at least it gives him a possibility to criticize Avicenna.
Yeah. No, thank you. And now turning to Abbas Amanat, who's joining us as well. Thank you for again for a great talk. Given that Safavid philosophers were interested in new texts such as Averroes, how come they remained entirely uninterested? And apparently, no, this is fascinating, unaware of Western philosophical works, i.e. Spinoza. No, this is a great conversation to have, which could have been closer to Mullah Sadr's perspective. Was it pure ignorance or the language barrier, or that European thought was considered as pagan and essentially could not have been approached if the latter return to Aristotle and Greeks would have been equally pagan? Oh, that's a very interesting question. Why a backward move to ancient philosophy was acceptable and not adopting a forward view of philosophy? At the same time, it's very interesting. If you look at Renaissance and moving forward, writers in Europe, there's several of these comments about the backwardness of Arabs and Saracens, quote unquote, of rejecting the philosophers, rejecting the sciences, and yet there's several accounts where the Persians are signaled out for during this very period of the 16 and 1700s for their embrace of philosophy. So the Europeans were clearly certain European circles were aware of philosophical activity going on in Iran. But right, how do you put this in a larger geopolitical global context?
Well, you know, what we know from these writers is that they were very keen on finding new sources. In the 17th century, they were very keen on finding new philosophical sources, whatever they could. So, I mean, some of them, like Ali Quli Beg, was the librarian. He was working as the librarian of the royal court. So he had access to all the possible, all works which were produced in Isfahan and were available to the Safavid scholars. What we can see is that they were keen, and they were keen in finding works, whatever they could, and some of them seems to be interested to know more about even European thought. We know that, for instance, Rajab Ali Tabrizi was in conversation with some missionaries. The fact that he was interested in having conversation with these missionaries shows that he had interest in exchanging ideas to learn from something from them. But language is a barrier. They didn't know anything about Europe because they didn't know European languages.
Yes, no. There's a great piece. I'm sure Abbas knows this as well on Rudy Mati on aloofness and fascination, Safavid views of the West, and it is a very complicated problem, isn't it? As well, like you said, through missionaries, through mercantile connections. Of course, the Mughals and the Ottomans will have much more in the way of direct contact. Not to say that the Safavids didn't. They clearly were aware of what was going on and at a high elite level, but it's a really interesting question and that global perspective. I just wanted to turn to Professor Griffel. Frank Griffel has also it's a question I have as well. How did the Iranian philosophers become aware of Averroes? I mean, I know this is part of the project you've been doing. So, if this happens in the early 17th century, were they influenced by Western intellectuals? I think this also kind of picks up on Abbas's question, who may have introduced Averroes due to the great fame he enjoyed in Europe. Exactly. It is fascinating that Ibn Rushd has this profound afterlife in European thought, you could say, in a way that is kind of sui generis. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I think it was when it started, it was probably through the manuscripts. That is my assumption so far, that when these manuscripts reached Isfahan, they studied them and they became interested in their contents. But it is possible that when these merchants came from Europe, these missionaries came from Europe, they also talked about Aristotle, about Averroes, and their significance to these scholars, and so they became even more interested in these writings. So it could be both. So, but I think the main cause was the arrival of these works, but it could have some additional. I mean,
and do the works come? What's the history of Ibn Rushd in the East prior to the Safavids in terms of codicology, the manuscript? Are these?
What I can tell you is that the works of Averroes were available in the Mamluk territory.
Right.
And until the fall of the Mamluks in 1616 or 1617, when the Sultan Salim, attacks
15, 16. I'm sorry.
15,
yeah,
15,
yeah,
16,
yeah,
or
yeah.
15, 16, or 15, 17.
Yeah.
Then Sultan Salim attacks Cairo, and things changes afterwards. Things change, and we see that some of these manuscripts scattered and went to other areas. Within a few decades, Tahafut was found, copies of Tahafut were made in Istanbul. So everything happened after the fall of the Mamluks.
Is there any in your research any kind of comparative trends in Istanbul that around, you mentioned that the Hafid was copied in the 16th century in Istanbul, is that right?
Yes.
And was there do we have any kind of engagement in this sense that parallels what's going on in, say, Isfahan?
Not to that extent, but we know, for instance, Tashkoprizadeh himself copied Tahafut for himself. So that means that he knew what in the text, and he read it.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go on. I'm so sorry. I was just curious, if there's something that's happening vis-a-vis Ghazali and all this too.
Yes.
Well, and the image of, because you mentioned Tashkoprizadeh, and since this is such a profound critique, right? Yeah.
Yes. See, at the time of the court of Mehmet, we know that Hoxhazadeh and al-Dīn Tusi both were engaged in evaluating Tahafut al-Philosopher of Ghazali. At the time when they evaluated Tahafut al-Philosopher, they didn't have Tahafut al-Tahafut. I mean, they could have mentioned it, but they didn't have it. But so one generation after, when Kamal Pasha-Zada wrote about Tahafut al-Philosopher, he didn't refer to this work. Only the student of Kamal Pasha-Zada, Tashkoprizadeh, had access to it. So we know that they arrived in Istanbul, but they arrived a few decades after the fall of Cairo. And not only this work, a few other manuscripts, a few other works of Averroes reached Istanbul in the 16th century. But it might be that Tahafut al-Philosopher, which was later brought to Iran, was brought from Istanbul. And the other two works, the other two codices, the short commentaries on natural philosophy and metaphysics, and the middle commentaries on logic, were brought directly from Cairo, or the area which was the territory of the Mamluks.
No, I just love again this broad geography that you're painting for us here, and the circulation and dissemination, and also discontinuities that are happening, and then recoveries as well. We have one last question here, and we've got two. One more just popped up. Great. So I'm happy to go through them both, if that's okay with you, Reza. I mean, it does just generate all of these questions, and it's so rich, and I think it's rich precisely because you're asking us to rethink these legacies and the continuities and also reformulations that happen in the course of history. Back on to a more philosophical side, we have an anonymous question to the issue of Avicenna's Siddiqeen and argument and to return to a more physical proof, i.e. the Aristotelian argument for motion, right? Did any of these Aristotelians, quote unquote, challenge Avicenna in this regard? Did you address some of the points of challenge? But yeah, it's around argument of motion.
Yeah. So Mifendesky actually said that it's not the right place to put. I mean, it's better to put it it's better to give a proof for God's existence in physics, not in metaphysics. So later on, Rajab Ali Tabrizi says that we can have it in both chapters. We can discuss it in physics, but we can also discuss it in metaphysics. So he said that it doesn't necessarily belong to metaphysics. And but so the other question, shall I? Yeah.
Oh, I can ask this too. The Mir Salar Razavi. This last question. Oh no, there's another. Okay. I mean, this is just a question around methodology too, in getting us back more into the process, the heuristic here of what can codicological evidence tell us. This is a perennial problem of what's lost is just we can't know certainly, and we can only kind of move from what we have in terms of manuscripts. How do you address this issue of that the extant manuscripts at our disposal aren't necessarily representative of all that's circulated?
Well, it is not. Obviously, there must be much more manuscripts that we have, but we can, have a, approximate number of them. We can tell how many of them are extant, and we can also say that it was popular based on the number of manuscripts that we have, but we cannot say how many manuscripts were produced at the time.
Yeah. No, it is a very difficult, problem that I think we all face when working with manuscripts. But just the sheer distribution and the circulation, the stories behind it, the commentaries, the marginalia, it's so rich and very textured and inviting us to imagine these networks in new ways. So, Reza, I think I just want to thank you again. I think this is probably a good inflection point to draw to a conclusion. I really appreciate you taking time there in Germany to speak with us and share your work with us. And I want to just thank you once more. I also will note to our audience that we have one last talk in our series in the Iran Colloquium from our own Latife Avani here, Codification as a Path to Reform the Modernization of Iranian Law in the 19th Century. That's going to be in December 6th, I believe, in person in Luce Hall, December 6th, our last talk for the Iranian Colloquium this fall. Again, Reza, thank you so much for sharing with us your work and spending time with us. Thank you.
Thanks.